review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He is a DJ, historian, professor, champion of R&B, and of course, a best-selling author too. No other than Mr. Amani Roberts.
Yes, yes. Thank you for having me.
Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Amani, and can you please introduce more about yourself?
As you said, best-selling author, DJ, college professor. Also work with musicians to help them earn more money. And in my free time, I love pancakes. Have a dog, and I live in Las Vegas.
I love that. To earn more money. Millions of money, Mr. Amani. How's that? And can you be my guest on Food 101 and let's talk about your pancake? And of course, my music 101. Please do
Hmm.
come over and let's talk about the music that you're talking about. So today
Yeah.
on Book 101 Review, let's talk about your best-selling book, The Quiet Storm. What inspired you to write, and how did your personal connection to R&B shape the book's narrative?
So I decided to write the book after it was my thesis in grad school. I went to Berklee College of Music, and then I turned it into a book. And really, I grew up. R&B music was a soundtrack to my childhood and a lot of my adulthood, so it's very close to me. And I was just really passionate about telling the story about all the R&B groups, then talking about what happened to them, why they disappeared, and what's going to happen next.
So, Mr. Amani, do you sing?
I do not sing. I try to, but I do not sing.
Just to clarify,
Yes, yes.
people, Mr. Amani don't sing. So the title, The Quiet Storm, pays homage to Smokey Robinson's album and the radio format. Why did you choose this title to frame the story of R&B groups?
So the title has many meanings. It also really gives credence to the radio format where I first would hear a lot of R&B groups because it would be late night, slow jams, dedications. You hear a lot of the R&B groups of the 60s, 70s, and 80s would get requested. They would play it. Then you have the Smokey Robinson song, which was actually the theme song for the one show I used to listen to, WHUR in Washington, D.C. And then really what has happened to R&B groups has been a literal quiet storm. Like most people don't realize it, but once you ask them or tell them or they see the book, they're like, you know what, you're right. What happened to all the R&B groups? So it was like a quiet storm that happened that caused them to disappear.
Disappear for sure. Your book cover R&B groups from the 1950s to the early 2000s. Which decade or group was the most fascinating to research and why?
Great question. I would say, of course, I'm partial to the 90s because that's when I grew up. That's a lot of my, young adulthood and childhood, and I think that was the heyday of R&B groups. I think also maybe the 70s was also a pivotal decade because there were so many groups that kind of reached their peak or whatever, and you had a lot of groups that influenced music from there on out. So I think like I'm biased to the 90s, and then the 70s were a great decade. You had groups like Earth, Wind, and Fire that got really big. You have like the Jackson Five or the Jacksons, Commodore. So a lot of groups then. And then the 90s, you have groups like TLC, Boys to Men, SWV. So there are a lot of groups there. And there's a bunch of other groups in between. I'm really partial to the Isley Brothers, which got their start in the 50s, the Whispers, who got their start in the 80s. We could talk about groups all day.
For sure. You highlight over 60 iconic groups, the Drifters to Destiny Child. How did you decide which groups to feature?
So we had a criteria when we doing the research. It was based on four things. It was based on Grammy nominations and wins, Billboard Hot 100 hits, record sales, and then notable performances. So we had a metric and a little algorithm that we calculate everything for each group, and that's how we selected maybe 10 or 11 groups per decade Then we had a decade where there were a lot of groups. There was an honorable mention section also, like for the 70s, 80s, and 90s. There was like an honorable mention section because there were so many groups that did so many great things.
The book explores the power, passion, pain, or of R&B groups. Can you share a specific story that encapsulates all three elements?
I love to talk about the Whispers. So, like I mentioned before, they're one of the favorites from the 80s, but they really got their start in the 60s. Their first single came out in 1964, and one of their major goals was to get a Billboard Hot 100 Top 10 hit. It took them 15 years from 1964 until 1979. They got their first Billboard Top 20 hit with And the Beat Goes On. Then it took them another 8 years to get their top 10 hit, which was Rock Steady, which happened to come out in 1987. So I always love to ask people like, what were you doing 23 years ago? Because it took them 23 years to get their goal. Another group would be the Isley Brothers. They are the only group in history, based on my research, to have a hit in 6 straight decades from the 50s all the way to the 2000s. They had hits in 6 straight decades, which is unprecedented. And they're also another one of my favorite groups that I learned more about when doing the research. And the Isley Brothers are one of the groups that has been sampled the most in hip hop music.
Interesting indeed, Mr. Amani. And thank you so much for sharing that's quite a point, too. Your
Thank you.
research began with your Berkeley thesis on the decline of black R&B groups. What surprising insights did you uncover during this process?
I think one of the main surprising insights is just the impact that like African American media had. You know, back in the day, we had like Ebony magazine, Essence, Jet, Vibe magazine. At its peak, it was over 8.1 million monthly subscribers. Once went through the musical recession, and a lot of these magazines either closed down and then came back as digital properties, or their subscription base just faded. That was a huge loss to R&B groups because they need the earned media and they weren't getting it. Then you had a couple TV shows like the Arsenio Hall show was really, really popular for promoting and allowing a lot of these groups to appear. Arsenio Hall went away and nothing took its place. All happened in the mid 90s. Then you had like In Living Color, another variety show which would feature R&B groups. That also went away like 7 days later after Arsenio Hall, and nothing really replaced that. So you have a combination of these magazines that go out of circulation. You have these TV shows that are canceled and not replaced, and that really hurt the groups because there wasn't a lot of earned media. They just lost TV time, and the genre itself was slower to adjust to like the digital landscape that was happening. So that's one big thing. Then the musical recession of like 2008 to 2013 that caused a lot of record stores to close. In I want to say in the mid 90s, there was over 9,100 record stores in the country. By 2012, there was only 4,500, and as of 2024, there were only 2,300 record stores. So you can see the amount of record stores has dropped tremendously. Of course, we're more into the digital age, but that is also where you would go on like a Saturday for meet and greets with groups, get to meet them, develop your fandom even more. And then on Tuesdays is when the new music will come out. So you go get your cassette, vinyl, CD. The landscape has changed, and it just really hurt R&B groups.
You discuss five main reasons why R&B group disappeared post 2000s. Can you share one or two of those reasons and their impact?
Yeah, so I talked about one of them was the African American media. That was one reason. Then you had the musical recession of 2008 to 2013. That was another one. The third one would be like the Telecommunications Act of, I think it was 1996. And what happened is that was supposed to diversify radio. What ended up happening is that Cumulus Media, Town Square Media, and iHeart Media bought up the majority of radio stations across the country. They then went to playlisting formats. So if you're in Seattle, Miami, DC, Chicago, you're generally going to hear the same songs on mainstream radio, and that hurt because a lot of these R&B groups got their start locally and were able to get on the radio. I remember hearing Shy was on WPGC 95.5 in DC. They were part of this show called DC Home Jams because that's where they were from. That's how they first got their start. Destiny's Child first got their start from Houston. TLC was in Atlanta. Boyz II Men was in Philly. All these groups had a really loyal following in their home cities and regions and would grow from there. And when radio stations go to a playlisting format, it takes away the organic, homegrown element, and it's harder for these groups to become popular, get radio spins, and grow their audience base.
The book includes personal anecdotes like your connection to your father and how did these personal touches shape the storytelling.
In each chapter, I'll share my favorite three songs from every group. I'll share my favorite three samples from every group, which leads into just how much of an influence R&B music has on hip hop. And then I'll also give my take on every group, what I learned about them, what I was surprised about, all those things. So that's kind of how I added my personal flavor on the book. And throughout the introduction, I explained just my exposure and first introduction to R&B groups, and so they're personal anecdotes throughout the entire book.
Mr. Amani, you mentioned industry politics like record label disputes and racial segregation policies. How these factors affect R&B groups' careers?
I think just with industry politics, it is very difficult for groups to stay together. Usually, you have like one lead singer who could be stronger than the rest, and so sometimes you have stories about labels kind of pitting the leader of the group against each other, wanting them to go solo to maximize revenue, so they don't have to pay for a group. Once we kind of came out of the recession and once we got to the 2000s, groups became just too expensive to manage, so radio executives kind of chose hip hop as an easier and more affordable and economical genre to pursue. I'm curious as to why they couldn't just keep promoting both, but that's a different story for a different day. So that's kind of how some of the politics came, because it's easier for a hip hop group to have a track, rap over it. You don't need choreography, you don't need backup singers, makeup, all these things you don't need. And so they just kind of went the economical route. So I think that was the really big factor when it came to industry politics. In terms of segregation, back in the 60s, there were a couple of groups that were really, really outspoken about what was going on in terms of civil rights. Like you had the Impressions, who had two songs, Keep On Pushing in 1964 and People Get Ready in 64. And then you had Sly and the Family Stone, who had Everyday People in 69. So particularly in the 60s and early 70s, R&B groups created the soundtrack to the civil rights movement.
The 1990s are described as the golden era for R&B groups. Why do you think this decade stood out and what made it special?
I think this is when you reach the peak of both Billboard Hot 100 hits and record sales. For example, there's really only two female groups that were based in the US history that have earned diamond status. One of them was TLC. They got diamond status for Crazy Sexy Cool, the album, the record breaking album. That's very rare. That hasn't happened since, didn't happen before. And then you had Boyz II Men, who had diamond selling album too. So you could just see the large amount of record sales and Billboard hits from groups. Also, when you look at, like, say it was a week in July in like 1997, where 14 of the 20 top 20 Billboard hits were from R&B groups. That just shows you the impact, where they were dominating the charts, which covers every genre. And you had groups that were extremely talented, extremely successful, like in Vogue, well, they never had a number one hit because they were always competing against all these other groups. And you had other groups like SWV who were legendary, but still were trying to play catch up with these groups. They were just groups dominating the entire decade from the early 90s. We had New Edition coming off a great run, and then you go to BBD from that group. Then you have Boyz II Men, TLC, In Vogue, you have 112, Jagged Edge, that came towards the end. Destiny's Child came towards the end. There were so many groups that were just dominant in the 90s, and it just has never, ever reached that same level of impact as it was in the 90s.
The book is both a textbook and popular history. How did you balance academic with accessibility for R&B fans?
So the book is set up where you will see the top 20, they're the top hits from each group that have reached the Billboard Hot 100 in chart format. You'll see where they were, if they had any Grammy nominations. So that's more of the kind of quantitative research. Then towards the end, you'll have my research findings, which is some additional. It's a combination of like qualitative and quantitative research. So you can use the beginning part of the textbook as a reference, and then you can get into the analysis and the rest of the statistics towards the end. So it makes for a really good, engaging textbook because there are different sections that you can use for different parts of a class.
Mr. Amani, as a DJ, historian, professor, champion, and best-selling author, what are your short-term and long-term goals?
I would say short term is to turn the book into a documentary. That's what's kind of starting right now, just the process of getting it sold to a streaming network and then doing the interviews and research. That's a high priority for the short term. Long term, in regards to the book, just continue to spread the word, get the book into the artist's hands so then I can interview them and get their opinions. That might take a little longer. And then in terms of the music business, I always love to share because there's so many music business lessons in the book that my long-term goal is just to close the knowledge gap between the music industry and the artist.
Good luck to your goals, Mr. Amani, and looking forward for more success. And what would be your piece of advice for those people out there want to be, of course, like you?
um, I would say, no matter what ups and downs you may face and trials and tribulations, just stick with whatever creative act you're doing. Surround yourself with a really supportive group of people. Don't give up. I know it's cliche, but just keep moving one step at a time and always stay creative and stay inspired.
Yes, thank you for that advice, Mr. Amani. And can you please recommend the book or books that influence your journey?
I would say, in addition to like my book, I'd say like I like everything you need to know about the music business. That's a Donald Passman book. I love that one. I love Luther Vandross's autobiography, Charlie Wilson from the Gap Band, his autobiography, and then The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. That's a great book to help you unlock your creativity. So those are four excellent recommendations.
Thank you for that recommendation, Mr. Amani. You express hope for reviving a legacy of R&B groups. What practical ideas do you purpose or propose for bringing their influence back?
I think we had a little bit of a clue when it came to like Silk Sonic when you had Anderson Paak and Bruno Mars joined together,
Yes.
and they had a group called Silk Sonic, and they were very successful with the record, Grammy award winning album and singles and Billboard Hot 100 hits. And then they don't really work together now because of creative differences. But if we were able to get similar groups, like a couple of female artists would get together and create an album, I think that would be good. Even some other guys could join together. I think that's kind of the format moving forward because they would already have their audience and their success. They can join together for one, two, or three albums and then do their solo projects. I think that could be a formula for success. I just want to watch and see what happens, and hopefully, we can return back to R&B being so influential on the charts.
Definitely. Let's bring back R&B in every part of the world. And reviews praise the book's storytelling and visual elements like photos and charts. How did you decide to incorporate these features?
Yeah, the photos was just an excellent decision on my part, just to really, really tap into archives. There are a lot of photos that you'll see in the book that are never been seen before, not very popular, and it really helps each chapter come to life. You see some black and white photos, you'll see color photos, you even see color photos from groups from the 50s and 60s, which is very rare. So the photos
Yes.
really take the book to a new level. So I'm proud of that. I had to work with Getty Images for the licensing, but it was well worth it. And I'm so proud of how the photos turned out. And then you have a lot of charts and just different things that people can reference to. They can always go back and say, where did this song place? What about this song? So in terms of the photos, the charts, then there's some QR codes in the beginning of the book where you can also have a playlist that you can kind of listen to as you're reading each chapter. So we have like the playlist, you have the photos, the charts. So it's a really immersive experience as you read the book.
How did your background as a DJ and music business professor inform the book's perspective on the R&B industry?
Being a music business professor, I knew about some of the issues in the industry and how a lot of groups will break up because of money. And so I knew that I was going to see that when I was looking at doing the research for each group. Then as a DJ, I play almost every group that's in the book. I play some of their music, even some groups from the 50s or 60s. So I was familiar with the groups. I was just able to learn more about them. I knew about samples because being a DJ, with hip hop and how they sample the R&B groups. So I was knowledgeable about many of the groups, the samples, my favorite songs. So it helped give me a running start to do research, to write, and to really put my own feelings and personality into the book.
Mr. Amani, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in fifth season, abstract poetry in second season, and my book 101 review in fifth season too, comedy 101 in second season, and my food 101 in fifth season as well, geography 101 in fourth season, and my baby podcast law 101 and mental health 101, love letters in third season, and Movie 101 Review and Music 101 in fourth season, and Science 101 and Sex 101 in its fourth season. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. Mr. Amani, what do you hope readers take away from The Quiet Storm, and how do you envision it sparking conversations about R&B legacy?
I just hope they take away and learn some of the stories they might not have been aware of, even some facts about their favorite group that they were unaware of, so that they can kind of embrace it and learn more about it, and just take away just the impact of these groups have had on culture around the world is not to be understated. Even in hip hop, a lot of hip hop would sample these groups. So just learn. That's one thing. I think also coming up in addition to the documentary will be a trivia game. So that's a good way for people to embrace the book, learn more, have fun with it, and just share it with a friend. Once you read it and you're inspired, share it with a friend and keep the Quiet Storm movement alive.
Definitely, Mr. Amani Roberts. Thank you so much for sharing your best-selling book to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your advocacy, your projects, or anything that you're doing right now?
Sure. If there's a musician that's listening and they've been moved and they like what I talked about in terms of the industry and the book, feel free to reach out to me, amaniexperience.com/call. And we can set up a call to talk about your music business and your career. And for all my other readers, you can find the book on Amazon or at thequietstormbook.com.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Amani Roberts, because if you support him, for sure, more and more and more best selling books to come. So, Mr. Amani, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
More to come, people. See you soon.